In this video, I'll share 5 battle mistakes to avoid in Pokemon TCG Pocket. I'm going to jump right into it with the first mistake to avoid, which is misplacing Pokemon at the beginning of the game. First of all, if you're going first, you should always only place one Pokemon into the active spot. Don't put anything onto your bench. You can do that during your turn, and at that time, you can take into account what your opponent has put onto their bench and into their active spot to sort of play against them properly. On the flip side, if you're going second, you might want to put more Pokemon out because you might need to play around the possibility of a red card, which could wipe out your hand. So if you have a good hand to begin with, you might want to get more Pokemon out there onto the bench. A lot of times this is decided for you. You just have one basic Pokemon at the beginning of the game. Of course, that's going to go into the active spot, and that's that. But if you have multiple options, multiple basic Pokemon at the very start of a game, there's almost always a right and a wrong choice if you have multiple options. So Druddigon, for example, is a great active spot starter. Something that can act as a wall is a really good starter too. Think about Snorlax or something that has high HP and an easy retreat cost. This allows you time to build up your Pokemon on the bench, soak up some attacks from your opponent in the meantime, then get that active Pokemon out and start attacking later in the game. The second mistake to avoid in battles is not anticipating what your opponent can possibly do in their following turn. It could be argued that this entire game is all about anticipating your opponent's next move. I can make an entire video about this topic, but this is where studying the cards in the game and understanding what they each do comes in handy. This is why it's so important to try out different decks and cards so that you're more familiar with them and how they work when someone plays them against you. So for example, anticipating that evolution from Geodude to Graveler, if you know that Graveler requires 3 energy to retreat, 2 energy to do 40 damage, and has 100 HP, you'll know a lot more about the possibility of your opponent's next turn and how to potentially counter it. Also, use the discard pile, especially later in the game, to check what cards your opponent might have left in their deck. Every deck can only have a max of 2 of each card, so ruling out a late game potion or a Sabrina can give you a huge advantage. Speaking of Sabrina, the third mistake in battle is misplaying Sabrina. Sabrina is an incredibly popular card. It's very powerful and it's played in most competitive decks, but I still see people misplay Sabrina against me all the time, almost giving me an advantage. So I'll give you the 2 main reasons you would want to use Sabrina. The first of which is to guarantee a future knockout on a benched Pokemon from your opponent's side, either right away or on a future turn. If your opponent only has one Pokemon on the bench and you use Sabrina, they have to put that Pokemon into the active spot. And if you have the attacking power to knock that Pokemon out, by all means, use Sabrina. The other primary reason I use Sabrina is usually early game. If you're not getting a great draw from your deck, you don't have the cards that you need, you can use Sabrina to slow your opponent down so you can get that Mewtwo back onto the bench, forcing your opponent to use energy or maybe an X speed to bring Mewtwo back to the active spot. And there are countless other similar situations where you can use Sabrina to delay your opponent. There are, of course, other situations where you might want to use Sabrina, for instance, moving an active Pokemon to the bench so you can hit them with Hitmonlee. That's a pretty fun, unique way to use Sabrina. But I've had people use Sabrina against me when I have the exact same Pokemon card on the bench, so I'm literally just swapping my active Pokemon with the same Pokemon on the bench. It's basically a wash, and my opponent wasted their Sabrina card. So my recommendation before using Sabrina is to analyze your opponent's benched Pokemon and think about what you would do if you were in their position. Which card would you put into the active spot if you were Sabrinaed? If that doesn't give you an advantage, hold off on using Sabrina until it's more useful. And my last thing on Sabrina before I move on is it's just as important to anticipate a potential Sabrina. Like I said, most decks run this card, so at least 1 copy or 2 are in your opponent's deck. And every turn you have to think about the possibility of Sabrina. So a lot of times it makes sense to fill up your bench with other less important Pokemon that you can move into the active spot in the event of a Sabrina so that your stronger Pokemon that you're trying to build up and you're adding energy to isn't at risk from attack until you're ready to move it into the active spot. The fourth battle mistake to avoid is not sacrificing a Pokemon when you should. Sometimes it's just best to sacrifice a less important Pokemon to an attack while you continue to build up more powerful Pokemon on your bench. So if you know you just need one more turn to get enough energy onto your Golem or onto your Gyarados, you can sacrifice that Froakie, throw him into the active spot so that you can delay until your other Pokemon are ready to do a ton of damage. The flip side of this is always going for the knockout when it's available. A lot of times it actually doesn't make sense to knock out your opponent's Pokemon. As an example, let's say you have 50 damage to deal to your opponent and their active Pokemon is just a basic non-EX, but on the bench they have their Celebi, which has 130 HP, and they're building that up in the background. Well, it might make sense to actually Sabrina or somehow find a way to attack the Celebi rather than taking the easy knockout point early game and weaken that more powerful Pokemon, putting them in a more difficult position. Or maybe you're in a situation where your opponent's active Pokemon has a really high retreat cost, maybe Onix, which takes 4 energy to retreat. In that situation, you know that you're safe from attacks until they have at least 2 energy on their Onix, in which case they could potentially use Leaf to take it out, but you may as well take that time to build up your bench and your Pokemon before you take out the Onix and allow them to bring something else to the front. This one is definitely less common because it does make sense usually to take your knockout points when they are available to you, but just think it through, make sure you're looking at the rest of the Pokemon on your opponent's bench before you make a decision. And the final battle mistake in Pokemon Pocket that I'm still guilty of on occasion is misplacing your energy. You get 1 energy from the energy zone per turn, and the obvious choice of where to put it isn't always the best one, especially when you're first starting out. For example, placing energy on an active Pokemon that is likely to get KO'd the following turn. If you're sacrificing a Pokemon, don't waste that energy on that Pokemon because as soon as it gets knocked out, the energy goes away with it. Another great example is if you're playing a deck with Misty and you have Misty in your hand and you plan on using it, make sure you use Misty before you place your energy zone energy. So if you play Misty on your Articuno and you get 4 heads, you have 4 energy on your Articuno EX now, you don't need that energy from your energy zone to go on Articuno as well. You can now use that on your active Pokemon to retreat it and get that Articuno into the active spot this turn. But if you played it the other way around and already placed the energy on Articuno before Mistying the Articuno as well, this could end up being a total waste of that energy when it could have gone to something else. And another way you can misplace energy is putting too much energy on your benched Pokemon. I always recommend putting 1 fewer energy onto your benched Pokemon than they need to do their strongest attack. So for example, if you have Articuno on your bench, you need 3 energy to do Blizzard, but if you don't plan on using Articuno this turn, you only need 2 energy on that card until it's time to actually do that attack. The same goes for Marshadow. You only need to put 1 energy on Marshadow until it's time to use Revenge. When it comes time to actually use the attack, you can move that Pokemon to the front lines, put that final energy on it, and use the attack. There are many other mistakes that you can make in this game, of course, like not paying attention to your weakness, but I think the more that you play, the more you'll learn about the game and the little nuances here and there. I hope this video helps you out and helps you win more games. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.